Welcome, everyone. Today, we drift into the fascinating world of the Middle Ages to explore what life expectancy was really like during that era. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more historical journeys. We'd love to hear from you. Comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. It's amazing to see people from all corners of the globe joining us on this adventure. When most people imagine life in the Middle Ages, their minds jump to images shaped more by movies and myths than by reality. They picture grim villages, smoky huts, people covered in dirt, and a world where everyone expected to die young. The phrase life expectancy was only 30 or 35 gets repeated so often that it almost feels like an unshakable truth. And because numbers sound scientific and authoritative, we rarely stop to ask what they actually mean. But as with many things in history, the truth is layered, nuanced, and often more surprising than the legend. To understand medieval life expectancy, we first need to step into the mindset of the time. Imagine being born into a world without modern hospitals, without vaccines, without antibiotics, and without the medical safety net we take for granted today. Every birth carried risk. Every illness carried risk. A simple cut could become infected and deadly, but at the same time, life was not a guaranteed sentence to suffering and early death. People formed families, built communities, farmed land, learned skills, worshipped, laughed, worked, argued, celebrated festivals, and dreamt of better futures. Their world was harsh, but it was also vibrant and fully alive. The average life expectancy figure can be deeply misleading, and here's why. When historians calculate average life expectancy, they have to include every death in the population, including infants who lived only hours, babies who died before they could walk, and children lost to the diseases that swept through nearly every community at some point. And infant mortality in the Middle Ages was enormous. Many children never lived long enough to be counted as lives by modern emotional standards, yet they counted heavily in statistics. A family might have 6 or 7 children, but only 3 would survive to adulthood. This tragedy, multiplied millions of times across centuries, dragged the average life expectancy down dramatically. So when we hear that life expectancy was 30, what it really means is this: the enormous number of children who died very young brought the overall average down. But if someone survived those dangerous first years, their odds of reaching adulthood and even old age grew much stronger. Farmers, monks, tradesmen, merchants, even peasants could and did live into their 40s, 50s, and beyond. Gravestones, church records, wills, and even letters show us individuals who lived long enough to see grandchildren grow, to witness political changes, and to reflect on the passage of time. In short, the medieval world did have elderly people. They simply had to make it through a far more dangerous childhood than we face today. Think for a moment about that childhood. For a newborn in the Middle Ages, survival was never guaranteed. Midwives, experience, and prayer helped, but complications during birth were common, and medical knowledge was limited. A baby could die from infection, from difficulty breathing, from being born too early, or from conditions doctors today could treat in minutes. Even after birth, dangers remained. Contaminated food or water, fever illnesses, measles, whooping cough, and diarrhea-related diseases took countless lives. Something as simple as teething fever, which we now understand as normal, could spiral into something deadly in a world without medicine. Parents knew this reality deeply, and that shaped how they viewed childhood. Some historians believe that medieval parents tried not to attach themselves too emotionally to very young children, fearing the pain of losing them. Others argue the opposite. Parents mourned intensely, writing poems and carving crosses, naming future children after those who died. Either way, death was a familiar shadow, and its constant presence shaped society emotionally, spiritually, and culturally. Yet surviving childhood changed everything. A child who reached the age of 10 or 12 had already proven resilient enough to withstand waves of disease that had swept through their village. They were likely stronger, hardened by work and life, and their bodies carried the scars and defenses of previous illnesses. These were the people who would go on to marry, raise families, work the fields, join guilds, enter monasteries, fight in wars, or manage estates. They were the backbone of medieval society, and many of them lived lives long enough to be considered full even by modern standards. Life expectancy also depended heavily on where someone lived. Medieval Europe was not one single world, but many overlapping worlds. A bustling city like Florence or London faced far higher risk of disease due to crowded streets, dirty water, and animals wandering freely. People lived close together, waste disposal systems were primitive, and infections could spread rapidly from neighbor to neighbor. Rural villages, by contrast, might avoid the worst epidemics, since communities were smaller and more isolated. But isolation brought other dangers: famine, lack of trade, and vulnerability to bad harvests. Climate played a role too. Long winters, crop failures, and unpredictable weather could trigger food shortages. Hunger made bodies weaker and more vulnerable to illness. Famine wasn't constant, but when it came, it reshaped entire generations. Some survived by stretching food, foraging, or relying on church charity. Others starved quietly, without records or monuments, another invisible influence on life expectancy. Gender mattered in its own way. For men, the primary threats were labor injuries, warfare, and disease. For women, childbirth stood as a constant risk. A woman might give birth multiple times throughout her life, and each pregnancy carried the possibility of infection, hemorrhage, or complications that doctors simply did not know how to treat. Many women died not from dramatic events, but from internal problems that slowly worsened without medical intervention. Still, countless women lived long lives, acting as family matriarchs, managing households, and shaping communities in ways far greater than records often show. Another misconception is that medieval people didn't care about disease, didn't understand health, or walked blindly through life without questioning their world. In reality, many were deeply aware of the fragility of life. They prayed, they experimented with remedies, they sought advice from elders, monks, wise women, and physicians when available. They were observant. They noticed which herbs seemed to help, which foods made illness worse, which water sources were safest. Knowledge spread slowly, often orally, but it did spread. Life expectancy numbers may look bleak, but human effort, the desire to survive and help others survive, was always present. It's important to remember that average. Life expectancy doesn't describe individual lives, it describes statistical fate. Imagine standing in a medieval village square. Around you are children playing, adults working, elderly people sitting near doorways sharing stories. If the average life expectancy were really 35, in the way many imagine, that scene would hardly exist. Instead, what truly existed was variation. Some died young. Many lived normal adult lifespans. A few lived surprisingly long lives and became respected elders, admired for their wisdom and endurance. So, when we talk about medieval life expectancy, we are really talking about the constant battle between fragile human bodies and an unpredictable environment. Disease could strike without warning. Weather could turn a plentiful year into a desperate one. Political changes and wars might disrupt markets and cause hunger. Yet through it all, medieval people continued to build communities, love their families, develop culture, create art, study philosophy, and imagine worlds beyond their own. They were not defined solely by death, they were shaped by their determination to live despite it. Today, when we look back and ask, how long did people live in the Middle Ages? We must understand that the question itself hides deeper realities. The medieval world was not a single story of misery. It was a world filled with risk, yes, but also with resilience. People found meaning in faith, in work, in relationships, in traditions. They adapted and learned. Their lives had rhythm and purpose, even if their statistical odds looked bleak on paper. Understanding the truth behind life expectancy doesn't just deepen our knowledge of history. It reminds us how extraordinary modern life truly is. Today, most children born in many parts of the world will grow into adulthood. Medical care can save lives that would have once been lost in minutes. Clean water, vaccinations, and antibiotics have rewritten the story of human survival. But none of that erases the effort, courage, and persistence of the people who lived long before us. They faced death far more often and still kept moving forward. And that is the real story of medieval life expectancy. Not a simple number, not a gloomy myth, but a complex and deeply human struggle to live, grow, and endure in a world that never guaranteed tomorrow. If someone survived the perilous years of childhood in the Middle Ages, their life was far from guaranteed, but their chances of reaching middle age, and sometimes even old age, improved considerably. To understand this, we need to imagine the rhythm of everyday medieval life, the cycles of work, family, faith, and survival that shaped how long people lived. Life expectancy was not just a number, it was the product of countless choices, social structures, environmental factors, and sheer luck. The medieval world, despite its hardships, offered pathways to longevity, but navigating those paths required resilience, adaptability, and often the favor of circumstances beyond human control. The first factor that influenced how long someone might live was social class. Europe in the Middle Ages was a world of hierarchies. The nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry experienced life very differently, and these differences affected survival in subtle but crucial ways. Nobles had access to abundant food, better shelter, and protection from the elements, which might suggest they had a clear advantage in life expectancy. Yet the reality was more complicated. Nobles faced dangers that peasants often did not: political intrigue, assassination, rebellion, and frequent involvement in wars and military campaigns. The pressures of leadership, the stress of wealth, and a diet heavy in meat and rich foods could contribute to chronic illnesses that sometimes claimed lives prematurely. Despite these challenges, members of the upper class did often have access to better medical care, physicians trained in the theories of the humors, access to herbal remedies, and attendants to oversee convalescence. This sometimes offset the dangers of lifestyle and politics, allowing some nobles to reach ages that might surprise modern audiences. For peasants, life presented a different set of challenges and advantages. Their work was physically demanding, often exhausting, and exposed them to harsh weather, injuries, and the occasional violence from bandits or feuding lords. However, their diet, though simple, was often more balanced than that of the wealthy. Grains, vegetables, legumes, and occasional dairy products formed the bulk of their meals, providing essential nutrients. They were more active physically, which could lead to greater overall health and resilience against certain diseases. Yet, peasants lived on the mercy of the seasons. Crop failures, harsh winters, and famine could reduce life expectancy dramatically. striking entire villages at once. In addition, poor sanitation and limited access to clean water in some regions could lead to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, or other illnesses that would sweep through communities with devastating speed. Survival, therefore, required a delicate balance: hard work, moderation, resourcefulness, and a bit of luck. Monks, nuns, and other members of religious orders often represented the most fortunate group in terms of life expectancy. Their daily routines involved moderate labor, prayer, and study, which together created a rhythm that was less physically punishing than the life of a peasant, yet more disciplined than that of a noble. Monasteries were centers of cleanliness and hygiene relative to the rest of society. They had access to clean water, prepared their own food, and often maintained herb gardens for medicinal purposes. Members of these communities were spared many of the dangers of warfare, travel, and political upheaval. The combination of routine, relative safety, and moderation often allowed monks and nuns to live into their 60s or 70s, with some even reaching remarkable ages. While we must remember that these were exceptions rather than rules, the consistency of their environment and lifestyle provides insight into the profound ways that structure and stability could extend life in the medieval world. Gender also played a crucial role in medieval life expectancy. Men faced risks associated with warfare, hunting, and physically demanding labor, while women faced the ever-present hazards of childbirth. Complications during pregnancy and delivery were major killers, with infection, hemorrhage, and exhaustion claiming many young mothers. The frequency of pregnancies increased the cumulative risk across a woman's life. Yet many women survived, becoming the backbone of family structures, managing households, and caring for children, the elderly, and the sick. Some lived long enough to see multiple generations grow, providing guidance and continuity within their communities. The interplay of biological vulnerability and social expectation shaped women's lives in a way that was both limiting and, in certain circumstances, empowering, as surviving mothers gained status and influence within the household and local society. The environment and geographic location were another decisive factor in survival and longevity. Cities, while centers of trade, education, and culture, were often rife with dangers that the countryside did not face. Crowded streets, poorly constructed buildings, and inadequate sanitation created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of infectious disease. Contaminated water, open sewers, and close contact with animals increased exposure to bacteria and parasites. Epidemics could erupt suddenly, decimating populations and affecting all social classes, though the poor generally suffered the most. In contrast, rural communities, although isolated and more vulnerable to famine, were less exposed to infectious disease. People in the countryside lived in smaller households and villages, which naturally limited the spread of illness. The rhythm of rural life, dictated by the seasons, agriculture, and local markets, also created a predictable structure that helped people plan, store resources, and survive environmental shocks. Luck, chance, and circumstance often outweighed skill and knowledge when it came to life expectancy. A well-fed peasant could die of an unexpected disease, while a frail monk might live a long life, simply because misfortune had not struck. Wars, raids, natural disasters, and epidemics did not discriminate entirely based on social class, although the wealthy could sometimes escape their effects more easily. Death in the medieval world was a constant presence, a reality acknowledged in art, literature, and religious practice. Yet amid this omnipresent threat, people lived full, meaningful lives. They formed communities, celebrated festivals, told stories, and maintained traditions that offered continuity and hope despite the fragility of existence. Education and literacy also subtly affected life expectancy. In the later Middle Ages, the ability to read and write was primarily concentrated among the clergy, nobility, and some merchants. Literacy allowed for the recording of medical knowledge, the observation of symptoms, and the passing down of remedies and preventative practices. Written records of epidemics, harvests, and famines provided early communities with a form of collective memory that could guide responses to future crises. Monastic scribes, for example, meticulously documented health, climate, and agricultural outcomes, allowing for a more informed approach to survival over generations. While literacy itself did not guarantee longer life, it facilitated practices and communication that indirectly improved the odds of survival. Nutrition and diet were fundamental, yet deeply intertwined with both geography and social standing. Peasants often relied on a subsistence diet of grains, legumes, and vegetables, supplemented by occasional dairy and meat when available. This diet, though monotonous, provided necessary calories and nutrients for the physically demanding life of laborers. Malnutrition, however, could occur during years of poor harvest, leading to weakness and increased susceptibility to disease. Nobles enjoyed a richer diet that included meat, sugar, imported spices, and wine. While lavish, this diet could contribute to chronic illnesses such as gout or obesity-related complications, demonstrating that wealth did not automatically equate to longer life. Those who balanced diet, activity, and moderation often fared better than those exposed to extremes of scarcity or indulgence. The culture of hygiene and cleanliness also played an unappreciated role in life expectancy. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did care about cleanliness, though the standards and methods differed from modern practices. Bathing was common in certain periods and regions, with public bathhouses in cities and private washing in rural homes. Monasteries maintained relatively high standards of cleanliness for both religious and practical reasons. Clothes were washed periodically, and hand-washing before meals was encouraged in many communities. These practices, combined with the knowledge of what was safe to eat and drink, helped mitigate some of the constant threats posed by disease, although many urban areas still suffered from epidemics and poor sanitation. Social networks and community ties were also vital for survival. Extended families, neighbors, and local guilds or religious organizations provided support during times of illness, famine, or labor shortages. People relied on these networks for food, assistance with work, and knowledge of local remedies. Those isolated from such support systems were at greater risk of early death, highlighting how social cohesion directly influenced life expectancy. Festivals, religious gatherings, and communal celebrations strengthened these bonds, fostering both mental well-being and practical resilience. The social fabric of medieval life, often overlooked, was therefore as crucial as diet, location, or occupation in determining who survived and thrived. While we often focus on mortality, it is equally important to consider what reaching adulthood meant in practical terms. A young adult who had survived childhood disease now faced the challenges of work, family, and social responsibility. Marriage and childbearing presented both risk and opportunity. A successful marriage could ensure economic stability, mutual care, and social status, all of which improved survival odds. Trades, farming, or monastic work provided structure and purpose, reinforcing health through activity and routine. In many ways, life expectancy was as much about navigating daily hazards and making wise choices as it was about innate physical resilience. Religious faith and ritual permeated life and indirectly shaped longevity. Prayer, fasting, confession, and adherence to religious codes created routines and offered psychological comfort that could improve mental resilience. Some monasteries and convents combined spiritual discipline with medical care, using herbal remedies and observation to treat ailments. Religious festivals often coincided with seasonal changes, marking time and encouraging community cohesion, both factors that enhanced survival indirectly. The spiritual dimension of life, often overlooked in modern discussions of life expectancy, played a subtle but important role in shaping daily habits, coping mechanisms, and community stability. Ultimately, life expectancy in the Middle Ages was not a single statistic but a mosaic of intertwined factors: childhood survival, social class, gender, occupation, geography, diet, hygiene, education, social networks, faith, and the unpredictable element of chance. It was a complex interplay of biology, environment, culture, and circumstance. To reduce it to a single number is to flatten a rich, dynamic human experience into a simplistic statement. Those who survived the early years often went on to live meaningful, productive, and sometimes surprisingly long lives. They raised families, contributed to communities, observed and recorded the world around them, and adapted to challenges that modern societies rarely face. Their longevity was not merely a matter of fate. It was a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the capacity to endure in the face of constant uncertainty. In reflecting on the lives of medieval adults, we see not just statistics, but people who navigated danger, worked diligently, and maintained bonds of love and obligation. They learned from experience, drew on community support, and passed knowledge down to the next generation. Each surviving adult was a triumph over countless invisible hazards. Each long life challenged the simplistic notion that the Middle Ages was a time of inevitable early death. In reality, those who survived childhood often lived long enough to shape the world around them, to influence family and society, and to leave marks in architecture, literature, and oral traditions that still echo today. To truly understand medieval life expectancy is to appreciate this delicate balance between danger and survival, between misfortune and resilience, between death and life. The adults who navigated this world with skill, caution, and some measure of luck reveal the extraordinary adaptability of humans. They remind us that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry of lived experience, where individuals carved out lives of purpose, connection, and endurance in a world that could be both harsh and beautiful. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a field unlike anything we recognize today. It was a complex mixture of observation, tradition, superstition, and religious belief. To understand the role it played in life expectancy, we need to step into the shoes of a medieval person seeking help for illness, injury, or chronic discomfort. Imagine living in a small village, a bustling town, or within the walls of a monastery. If you became ill, your options were limited and often unpredictable. Knowledge of disease was rudimentary, and treatments were guided by a combination of ancient theories, personal experience, and faith. Yet within these limitations, medieval people developed a sophisticated, albeit imperfect, understanding of health, demonstrating resilience, ingenuity, and the desire to survive against formidable odds. One of the central frameworks for understanding disease in medieval Europe was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This ancient Greek system, carried forward by Roman scholars and adapted by medieval physicians, proposed that the balance of these humors within the body determined health. An excess or deficiency in any of the four could result in illness. Bloodletting, purging, herbal remedies, and diet adjustments were prescribed to restore balance. While this system might seem strange or primitive today, it offered a coherent way for people to approach disease in a time when germ theory and cellular biology were unknown. Patients and practitioners alike sought to understand their bodies within this framework, applying remedies that sometimes worked, sometimes harmed, but always reflected the earnest pursuit of healing. In towns and cities, physicians were often formally trained in universities or through apprenticeships. They studied the humoral theory in texts translated from Arabic, Latin, and Greek, learning the classical teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. Yet even trained doctors faced immense limitations. Diagnoses were based on observation, patient description, and visual signs such as the color of the tongue, the pulse, or urine samples. There was no laboratory testing as we know it today, no antibiotics, no vaccines, and no understanding of bacteria or viruses. Infections, even minor ones, could easily become life-threatening. A small wound, untreated or treated improperly, might fester and lead to systemic illness. In this sense, medieval medicine was as much about prevention, moderation, and environmental control as it was about active intervention. Barbers, too, played an important role in medieval medicine. They were more than hair cutters. They performed basic surgical procedures such as removing teeth, lancing abscesses, and even bloodletting. The red and white-striped pole that survives in barber shop signage today originates from this dual role, the red representing blood, the white representing bandages. Surgical procedures were painful, dangerous, and often performed without anesthesia, yet they offered the possibility of relief from injuries and conditions that would otherwise be fatal. A successful procedure could extend a person's life, but failure could end it. The stakes were high, and survival often depended on both the skill of the practitioner and the resilience of the patient. Herbal medicine was another cornerstone of medieval health care. Monasteries often maintained gardens where monks cultivated medicinal plants, experimenting with combinations and documenting their effects. Herbs like rosemary, sage, thyme, and willow were used to treat a range of ailments from digestive issues to fevers. Some remedies were surprisingly effective. Willow bark, for example, contains salicin, a chemical precursor to aspirin, which could reduce pain and fever. Yet the line between remedy and poison was thin, and misidentification of plants could result in severe illness or death. People learned from experience, passed knowledge orally, and relied on trial and error across generations. This herbal tradition, combined with spiritual rituals, created a form of medicine that was deeply integrated into daily life. Religion and faith played a profound role in medieval medicine. Illness was often interpreted not only as a physical imbalance, but as a spiritual test or punishment. Pilgrimages to holy sites, prayers, fasting, and offerings were common forms of healing. Monks and nuns provided both physical and spiritual care, blending herbal remedies with rituals intended to restore harmony between the body, mind, and soul. Hospitals operated by religious institutions appeared in many towns and cities, particularly in the later Middle Ages. These hospitals were not centers for cure in the modern sense, but offered shelter, food, basic care, and prayer. They were often staffed by clergy or lay attendants trained in rudimentary medical practices. Their existence demonstrates the medieval understanding that care and compassion were inseparable from treatment, reflecting a holistic approach to survival in an uncertain world. Understanding the limitations of medieval medicine also requires examining the everyday challenges faced by individuals. Urban areas, for example, were crowded, unsanitary, and conducive to the rapid spread of disease. Water contamination, open sewers, and the proximity of animals to humans facilitated outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and other illnesses. Rural areas were not immune. Famine, exposure to harsh weather, and limited access to treatment created persistent health risks. Injuries sustained while farming, hunting, or traveling were common. Even minor infections could become life-threatening without proper care. Knowledge, while imperfect, gave people tools to mitigate some risks, but luck remained a decisive factor. The medieval period also witnessed epidemics that shaped both medicine and society. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, is the most infamous example. Entire populations were decimated within months, overwhelming physicians, barbers, and religious caregivers alike. Physicians were helpless in the face of a disease whose cause and transmission were unknown, relying instead on prayers, quarantines, and humoral theories. The psychological impact of such pandemics influenced medical practices, public health measures, and societal attitudes toward life and death for generations. It highlighted the limitations of human knowledge and the persistent vulnerability of even the healthiest individuals. Social status and wealth influenced access to care and, consequently, life expectancy. Nobles could afford private physicians, elaborate diets, and safer living conditions. Peasants, however, relied on local remedies, midwives, barbers, or clergy, often delayed in receiving care until illness became severe. Yet, paradoxically, peasants were sometimes more resilient. Their diet and active lifestyles contributed to robust health, and the simplicity of rural life shielded them from certain urban risks. Monastic communities offered another contrast. Disciplined routines, moderate diets, and relative isolation allowed members to live longer than many of their contemporaries. Survival, therefore, was not determined solely by wealth or intelligence, but by the intersection of environment, knowledge, and circumstance. The cultural understanding of illness also shaped survival strategies. Medieval people were highly observant of their bodies and surroundings, even if their explanations differed from modern science. They noted the seasons when fevers were most common, the food that strengthened the body, and the herbs that alleviated symptoms. This empirical knowledge, though framed within spiritual and humoral contexts, was remarkably practical. Families often developed their own remedies, passing down recipes and practices across generations. Communities shared advice and observation, creating a distributed, informal system of health care that, while imperfect, saved lives. In the absence of modern medicine, knowledge, caution, and attentiveness were vital tools in extending life expectancy. The impact of medieval medicine on life expectancy was thus a blend of active intervention, preventive measures, and social structures. Clean water, hygiene practices, proper nutrition, religious routines, herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and community care all contributed in varying degrees to survival. The absence of advanced scientific understanding did not preclude ingenuity or resourcefulness. People navigated illness with a combination of observation, tradition, and faith, demonstrating that medicine in the Middle Ages was adaptive, experiential, and deeply human. While it is tempting to dismiss medieval medicine as wholly primitive, this view underestimates its complexity and the role it played in prolonging life for those who survived childhood. Life expectancy figures alone cannot capture the rich tapestry of practices, beliefs, and experiences that defined health in the Middle Ages. People survived through a combination of luck, skill, community support, and the limited tools available to them. Their efforts, though constrained by the knowledge and technology of the era, reflect a remarkable commitment to preserving life in the face of uncertainty and danger. Even beyond hospitals, monasteries, and physicians, everyday practices shaped survival. Dietary regulation, seasonal fasting, observation of environmental patterns, and attention to cleanliness all contributed indirectly to life expectancy. Communities developed norms that encouraged behaviors reducing risk, washing hands before meals, using herbs for minor ailments, and observing periods of isolation during outbreaks. These practices, while simple, demonstrated an empirical understanding of risk and prevention, even if couched in spiritual and humoral terms. Human ingenuity, observation, and adaptability were therefore as much a part of medieval medicine as surgical instruments or herbal concoctions. The interconnection of medicine, environment, faith, and social structure made life expectancy in the Middle Ages far more complex than a single statistic could convey. A person's ability to survive depended on a chain of factors: surviving early childhood, accessing knowledge or care, maintaining physical resilience, and navigating the social and spiritual frameworks of their community. Each illness, injury, or outbreak presented both a threat and an opportunity for adaptive behavior. Those who learned, observed, and adjusted were more likely to survive, and their experiences laid the groundwork for the gradual evolution of medical knowledge over subsequent centuries. Ultimately, medieval medicine reflects a human story of resilience, ingenuity, and determination. It demonstrates how societies adapted to the limitations of knowledge and resources, how communities organized to protect vulnerable members, and how individuals sought to survive and thrive despite constant threats. It also highlights the enduring interplay of body, mind, and spirit in human health, illustrating that survival is never purely physical. The adults who lived through the Middle Ages and into adulthood were beneficiaries of a vast, interconnected system of knowledge, practice, observation, and faith, all operating in a world without the scientific certainties we now take for granted. The study of medieval medicine, therefore, is not merely about procedures, treatments, or failures. It is a window into the resilience of humanity itself. It reminds us that life expectancy was not fixed, that death was omnipresent but not inevitable, and that those who survived early challenges were equipped with strategies, wisdom, and fortitude that allowed them to live meaningful and, at times, remarkably long lives. Each healer, each patient, each community member contributed to a tapestry of survival that stretched across centuries, shaping the very foundations of human understanding of health, disease, and care. In reflecting on medieval medicine, we gain insight not only into the dangers of the past, but also into the human spirit that confronted them. The careful observation of symptoms, the cultivation of medicinal herbs, the ritualized prayers, and the development of communal care networks all reveal a society deeply engaged with the challenges of mortality. Life expectancy in this context becomes not a mere number, but a reflection of the intricate dance between environment, knowledge, community, and the unpredictable hand of fate. Medieval medicine, imperfect though it was, played an essential role in this dance, offering hope, relief, and sometimes salvation to those navigating a world fraught with uncertainty. The Middle Ages were a world where disease, famine, and sudden disaster were constant companions, shaping the very rhythm of daily life. For those living in this era, survival was never guaranteed, and the precariousness of existence influenced not only personal decisions, but also the broader structure of society. Life expectancy was deeply affected by these external forces, and understanding them provides a window into the lived experience of medieval people. To grasp the realities of health and mortality in the Middle Ages, one must consider not only individual resilience and social class, but also the overwhelming impact of epidemics, recurring famines, and endemic illnesses that swept through populations with frightening regularity. Disease was perhaps the most immediate and unpredictable threat to life. While childhood mortality accounted for a significant portion of early deaths, adults were not immune from the ravages of illness. Communities existed in a delicate balance with their environment, and even minor outbreaks could quickly escalate into crises. One of the most devastating episodes in European history was the Black Death, which arrived in the mid-14th century. Between 1347 and 1351, this pandemic swept across the continent, killing an estimated one-third to half of Europe's population. Entire villages vanished, families disappeared overnight, fields were left unplowed, livestock perished, and social order was shaken to its foundations. The psychological impact of such widespread death was immense, creating both fear and superstition, while challenging the medical knowledge and social structures that had previously governed life. Physicians, barbers, midwives, and clerics were overwhelmed. They could observe symptoms, attempt remedies, and offer prayers, but the speed and lethality of the plague often made their efforts futile. In towns and cities, where people lived in close quarters, the disease spread with terrifying efficiency. In rural areas, isolation sometimes offered protection, but even remote communities were not completely safe, as trade routes and travelers could carry infection across miles of countryside. The causes of disease in the Middle Ages were poorly understood by contemporary standards. The humoral theory guided treatment, and religion offered explanations, yet neither could prevent the devastation of pandemics like the plague. People interpreted outbreaks as divine punishment, a test of faith, or a manifestation of imbalance in the natural order. Pilgrimages, prayers, and offerings were common responses. Citizens were instructed to purify themselves, avoid moral corruption, and engage in communal rituals to appease higher powers. While these measures could not stop pathogens, they reflect the medieval mindset, an understanding that disease was intertwined with morality, environment, and spirituality, and that survival required both physical and spiritual vigilance. Epidemics were not limited to the Black Death. Leprosy, tuberculosis, dysentery, typhoid, smallpox, influenza, and a host of other infectious diseases plagued Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Leprosy, in particular, carried both physical and social consequences. Those afflicted were often isolated in leper colonies, ostracized from communities, and stigmatized by both fear and religious interpretation. While leprosy progressed slowly, the social and psychological toll was profound, affecting both survival and quality of life. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, gradually weakened the body and often resulted in a prolonged death, while dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases could strike quickly, especially in times of famine or contaminated water. These conditions highlight the precariousness of life even for adults who had survived childhood. Mortality in the Middle Ages was not limited to the young. Adults remained vulnerable to sudden outbreaks and lingering illnesses. Famine was another persistent and deadly force shaping medieval life expectancy. Agricultural production was entirely dependent on weather, soil quality, and the labor of human and animal hands. Crop failures could result from drought, excessive rain, early frost, or pest infestations. In years of shortage, starvation became a real threat, weakening the population and making people more susceptible to disease. During prolonged famines, such as those that occurred in the early 14th century before the Black Death, entire regions experienced heightened mortality rates. Villages were abandoned, social unrest increased, and mortality statistics reflected the grim reality. Survival was as much a matter of circumstance as of health or personal skill. In addition, famines often created secondary crises. Malnutrition lowered resistance to infections, disease spread more easily among weakened bodies, and social tensions could erupt into violence. Those who survived had to rely on a combination of resourcefulness, community support, and sometimes sheer luck. Environmental factors intertwined with disease and famine in ways that modern audiences might struggle to imagine. Towns lacked effective sanitation systems, and waste often contaminated water supplies. Rivers, streams, and wells carried the byproducts of human habitation and animal life, providing breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites. The combination of contaminated water, inadequate waste management, and crowded living conditions created the perfect environment for epidemics to flourish. Urban centers were particularly vulnerable as people lived and worked in close proximity. Trade brought new pathogens from distant lands, and poor hygiene compounded existing risks. Rural areas, while safer from rapid transmission of disease, faced their own challenges. Isolation could protect against epidemics, but it could also mean delayed assistance for injuries, famine, or localized outbreaks. The interplay between environment, settlement patterns, and human activity was a constant determinant of life expectancy. Medicine, while developing, could only mitigate some of these threats. Physicians and healers relied on observation, experience, and inherited knowledge. Herbal remedies, bloodletting, purges, and spiritual rituals were common treatments, and monasteries played an essential role in the cultivation of medicinal plants and the care of the sick. Hospitals run by religious orders offered shelter, food, and basic treatment, though their capacity was limited. Despite these interventions, the lethality of epidemics and famine often overwhelmed available resources, demonstrating that survival was as much a matter of circumstance as of medical skill. Communities that could coordinate care, distribute food, and enforce sanitary practices fared better, highlighting the social dimension of survival in the Middle Ages. The psychological impact of disease and famine was also significant. Living in constant awareness of mortality affected behavior, social norms, and cultural practices. People developed rituals, prayers, and customs designed to protect against misfortune, reflecting a deeply embedded understanding that life was fragile and uncertain. Fear of sudden illness or famine influenced everything from settlement patterns to agricultural decisions, from marriage timing to religious observance. Life expectancy was not just a matter of biology, but of social and cultural adaptation to a world in which death could come quickly and without warning. Interestingly, survival through epidemics and famine sometimes resulted in unexpected social changes. After the Black Death, for example, the dramatic reduction in population led to labor shortages that improved conditions for surviving peasants. Wages rose, social mobility increased, and opportunities for better nutrition and living conditions expanded. In other words, the forces that devastated communities also reshaped them in ways that could improve life expectancy for those who lived through the crisis. These patterns reveal the dynamic interaction between population pressures, environmental conditions, and human agency in shaping survival. Daily life was permeated with practices aimed at preventing or mitigating disease. People observed seasonal changes, dietary guidelines, and hygiene routines to maintain health. Herbs were grown for both culinary and medicinal purposes. Water sources were selected carefully when possible, and periods of fasting or ritual cleansing were thought to purify the body. Communities established norms for care of the sick, isolation of the infected, and management of waste. While these measures were imperfect, they reflect a systematic attempt to navigate the omnipresent risks of disease and famine. The survival of adults into middle age and beyond often depended on adherence to such practices, as well as on the support of family, neighbors, and religious institutions. The unpredictability of epidemics further emphasizes the importance of social cohesion. Those who were part of strong communal networks had better chances of survival. Family members cared for the sick, shared resources during famine, and provided spiritual and emotional support. Religious institutions offered guidance, shelter, and care, reinforcing bonds that were essential to resilience. Isolation, lack of resources, or social marginalization increased vulnerability, demonstrating that life expectancy was shaped not only by personal health, but by the strength of social networks and collective action. Geography, climate, and trade routes also influenced exposure to disease and famine. Coastal cities and towns along rivers were connected to regional and international trade networks, which brought not only goods, but also pathogens from distant lands. Inland villages were somewhat protected but still susceptible to local epidemics and crop failures. The climate of the period, including variations such as the Little Ice Age, affected agricultural yields and created periods of scarcity that heightened mortality risk. The interaction of environmental conditions, human behavior, and disease created a complex landscape in which life expectancy was highly variable, dependent on both personal circumstances and larger systemic factors. Religious beliefs shaped both the perception and response to disease. Illness was often interpreted as a test of faith, divine punishment, or spiritual imbalance. Pilgrimages, prayers, rituals, and offerings were common responses, sometimes in conjunction with herbal remedies or medical interventions. The intertwining of faith and medicine provided not only a framework for understanding illness, but also psychological comfort, which may have had indirect effects on survival. Belief systems reinforced social cohesion, guided behavior, and offered coping mechanisms in a world where the next epidemic or famine could strike without warning. In analyzing medieval life expectancy, it becomes clear that disease and famine were not merely biological phenomena, but also social, environmental, and cultural forces. The combination of contagious illness, chronic malnutrition, limited medical knowledge, and environmental unpredictability created a landscape in which survival required vigilance, resourcefulness, and adaptation. Those who navigated these challenges successfully often reached adulthood and middle age, and a subset even lived into their 60s or 70s. Life expectancy statistics, when interpreted carefully, reflect the precariousness of early life, but also the remarkable resilience of adults who survived childhood. The lessons of medieval epidemics and famine are manifold. They highlight the critical importance of social networks, knowledge, and communal practices in extending life. They reveal the interplay between environmental factors, human behavior, and disease. They demonstrate that survival was not solely a matter of individual health, but also of collective organization, spiritual practice, and adaptive strategies. By studying these patterns, we gain insight into the lived experience of medieval people and the complex factors that shaped life expectancy beyond simple statistics. Ultimately, the Middle Ages were a world in which life was fragile, uncertain, and yet enduring. Disease and famine imposed harsh limits, but human ingenuity, observation, faith, and community offered pathways to survival. Those who navigated these challenges successfully demonstrated resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to endure in the face of constant threat. Understanding the impact of disease and famine on life expectancy allows us to appreciate not only the difficulties faced by medieval people, but also the ways in which they overcame them, leaving a legacy of knowledge, culture, and survival that continues to inform our understanding of human resilience today. Life in the Middle Ages was defined as much by work and food as by disease and death. Survival depended on the daily routines of labor, the rhythm of the seasons, and the careful management of scarce resources. The people who lived through this era experienced lives of intense physical activity, rigorous schedules, and constant adaptation to environmental and social pressures. Their work was not merely a necessity for sustenance, it was a determinant of life expectancy, shaping physical health, resilience to illness, and the ability to survive both famine and societal instability. To understand medieval life expectancy, we must delve into the ways in which labor, nutrition, and conflict intertwined to influence how long people lived. The majority of the medieval population were peasants, bound to the land in ways that structured nearly every aspect of their existence. Farming was physically demanding work, requiring long hours, heavy lifting, and exposure to the elements. From dawn until dusk, peasants plowed fields, sowed seeds, tended livestock, and harvested crops. This labor-intensive lifestyle strengthened muscles, improved endurance, and contributed to robust physical health, factors that could enhance longevity. However, the risks were significant. Accidents with tools or animals could result in serious injury, exposure to harsh weather could lead to illness, and repetitive physical strain often caused chronic pain or skeletal deformities. Life expectancy was therefore closely tied to one's ability to endure and adapt to the demands of daily labor, and those who survived these challenges often developed resilience that carried them into adulthood and beyond. Nutrition was inextricably linked to both labor and survival. Peasants relied heavily on a diet of grains such as wheat, rye, or barley, which provided essential calories but were often deficient in certain nutrients. Legumes, cabbage, onions, and root vegetables supplemented this basic diet, while dairy products, eggs, and occasional meat contributed protein and fat. Meat was scarce and usually reserved for special occasions or for wealthier classes. This diet, while simple, provided the energy needed to sustain long hours of physical labor, yet it was highly vulnerable to seasonal and environmental factors. Crop failures caused by drought, frost, floods, or pests could devastate food supplies, resulting in periods of hunger and malnutrition. Malnourished individuals were weaker, more susceptible to disease, and less able to recover from illness or injury. Thus, nutrition was a critical determinant of life expectancy, and survival often depended on both local agricultural success and careful storage of food for lean months. The rhythm of the agricultural year also influenced mortality and life expectancy. The planting season required intense labor, often beginning in early spring, while summer brought the strenuous work of tending crops. Harvest time was both laborious and vital, as the success of the year's crops determined survival through winter. Famine often struck during the hunger season, the months between winter stores running low and the new harvest. During these periods, families relied on preserved grains, foraged foods, and whatever small quantities of meat or dairy remained. Poor harvests could trigger local crises, increasing mortality rates, especially among children and the elderly. Food scarcity also weakened immune systems, making people more vulnerable to infectious diseases that might otherwise have been manageable. The precarious balance between labor, food supply, and environmental conditions underscores how tightly work and sustenance were linked to life expectancy. For the nobility, work was less physically demanding but still influential on health and survival. Lords and ladies managed estates, oversaw agricultural production, and engaged in political and military affairs. Their diets were richer, often including abundant meat, sugar, pastries, and imported spices. While these foods provided calories and variety, they could also lead to chronic conditions such as gout or obesity-related complications. Nobles faced different kinds of stress, warfare, political intrigue, and the pressures of leadership. Injuries sustained in battle or duels were often fatal, particularly in the absence of effective medical care. Yet their relative wealth provided access to physicians, secure housing, and better nutrition, which could offset some of the risks inherent in their lifestyle. In other words, the relationship between work, diet, and life expectancy was complex and mediated by social class. Monastic communities offer another perspective on the interplay of labor and survival. Monks and nuns followed structured routines that combined moderate physical work, prayer, study, and communal life. They tended gardens, maintained buildings, brewed beer, copied manuscripts, and engaged in charitable activities. This balanced lifestyle, coupled with regular nutrition and clean living conditions, often allowed members of religious orders to live longer than the average population. Their labor was purposeful and sustainable, avoiding the extremes of exhaustion faced by peasants while providing activity that contributed to physical and mental well-being. The structured environment, together with social cohesion and religious guidance, illustrates how work in the Middle Ages could support longevity when balanced with care, moderation, and community support. War and conflict were also integral factors influencing life expectancy. Europe in the Middle Ages was not peaceful, territories were contested, and the frequent presence of armed conflict meant that men of fighting age were exposed to significant risk. Soldiers faced the immediate dangers of combat wounds from swords, arrows, or siege engines, as well as the indirect threats posed by infection, malnutrition, and disease in military camps. Armies often spread illness as they moved, affecting both combatants and civilians. Interestingly, statistical analysis suggests that, while war increased mortality risk for certain demographics, disease and famine were more deadly overall. Many men who survived battles nonetheless fell victim to infection or chronic malnutrition later. Thus, warfare was only one of multiple overlapping factors shaping life expectancy. Occupational hazards extended beyond the battlefield. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, miners, and merchants all faced risks specific to their trades. Blacksmiths and metal workers dealt with heat, fire, and heavy materials, while miners faced tunnel collapses and exposure to dust and toxic minerals. Merchants and traders risked robbery, accidents during transport, and exposure to disease through travel. These occupational hazards, combined with limited medical knowledge, meant that adulthood did not guarantee safety. Yet survival within these trades depended on skill, caution, and experience. Those who navigated their work environment successfully were often able to reach middle age or older, demonstrating the interplay of human ingenuity and environmental adaptation in medieval life. Daily life also involved careful management of resources, which had a direct impact on survival. Water sources had to be selected carefully to avoid contamination, and food had to be stored and rationed to last through months of scarcity. Clothing, shelter, and firewood were essential for protection against the elements. The failure of any of these necessities could lead to illness, injury, or death. Communities often developed systems for sharing resources, maintaining wells, and protecting grain stores, reflecting a collective understanding that survival required both individual diligence and communal cooperation. Those who lived in well-organized towns or villages had better chances of reaching advanced age, while those in isolated or poorly managed areas faced higher mortality risks. The cultural practices surrounding food and work also had social dimensions. Feasts, festivals, and communal labor provided opportunities for social bonding. reinforcing networks that could offer support during illness or scarcity. Marriage and family structures facilitated the sharing of labor and resources, creating interdependence that increased resilience. Community rituals often coincided with agricultural cycles, linking social cohesion with survival. These practices demonstrate that life expectancy was influenced not only by physical factors, but also by social organization, tradition, and cultural norms that encouraged cooperation, resource sharing, and mutual care. Food scarcity and famine had profound ripple effects on medieval life. During periods of shortage, the quality and quantity of food declined, weakening populations and increasing vulnerability to disease. Malnutrition disproportionately affected children and the elderly, yet it also impacted adults, reducing work capacity, slowing recovery from illness, and increasing susceptibility to epidemics. Families and communities had to adapt by rationing, relying on foraged foods, or traveling to find resources. In urban centers, scarcity could lead to social unrest, riots, and political instability, further threatening survival. In rural areas, poor harvests could decimate local populations, emphasizing how closely tied life expectancy was to agricultural success and environmental conditions. The ways in which medieval people procured and prepared food also influenced health and longevity. Grains were milled, baked into bread, or boiled into porridge. Vegetables were cooked in stews, often with herbs that had medicinal properties. Meat, when available, was preserved through salting or smoking, though limited refrigeration increased the risk of foodborne illness. Dairy products provided essential nutrients, though spoilage was common. Water quality was variable, and people often boiled or filtered it when possible. These practices reflect a pragmatic approach to survival, demonstrating awareness of risk factors and strategies to mitigate them within the constraints of available technology and knowledge. Nutrition, labor, and survival were intertwined with broader economic and social structures. Peasants owed labor or rent to their lords, merchants engaged in trade networks, and artisans relied on guilds for protection and support. These obligations shaped daily routines, access to resources, and exposure to risk. Those who successfully navigated economic and social hierarchies often enjoyed better nutrition, safer working conditions, and improved access to care, all of which contributed to longer life expectancy. Conversely, those on the margins of society faced compounded risks from poor diet, overwork, and limited protection from environmental hazards. Mental and spiritual resilience also played a role in survival. Work, while physically demanding, provided structure, purpose, and identity. Religious belief offered psychological support, rituals for coping with uncertainty, and communal solidarity. Festivals and social gatherings provided respite from labor and reinforced connections that could be vital in times of crisis. Together, these factors illustrate that life expectancy was shaped not only by material conditions, but also by the capacity to endure, adapt, and maintain social and spiritual bonds. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was therefore a reflection of the complex interplay between work, nutrition, war, environment, and social organization. Daily labor was both a necessity and a determinant of health, with physical activity, exposure to risk, and resource management influencing survival. Diet provided sustenance, but was vulnerable to seasonal fluctuations and famine. Social structures, including family, community, and religious networks, offered protection and resilience. Conflict, disease, and environmental unpredictability imposed constant threats, yet human adaptability, ingenuity, and cooperation allowed many individuals to reach middle age and beyond. Survival was a multidimensional endeavor requiring the alignment of physical, social, and environmental factors. By examining the connections between labor, food, war, and daily survival, we gain insight into the lived experience of medieval people and the factors that shaped life expectancy. We see that longevity was not a simple product of biology, but the outcome of navigating a complex web of physical demands, environmental pressures, social structures, and cultural practices. Those who survived the harsh realities of medieval work and scarcity were testaments to human resilience and adaptability, demonstrating that even in a world fraught with danger, individuals and communities could thrive, endure, and leave legacies that shaped the generations that followed. Ultimately, the story of work, food, war, and survival in the Middle Ages is a story of human perseverance. It reminds us that life expectancy was not determined by a single factor, but by the cumulative effect of choices, circumstances, and adaptation over a lifetime. Those who survived childhood navigated daily labor, managed resources, avoided or endured famine and disease, and found support within their communities often lived lives that, while arduous, were rich in experience, achievement, and meaning. The Middle Ages were a world of challenges, but also a world of resilience, ingenuity, and human determination that continues to fascinate and instruct us today. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration of life expectancy in the Middle Ages, it becomes clear that survival was a multifaceted challenge shaped by biology, environment, society, and chance. Those who lived through childhood navigated disease, famine, labor, and social pressures, and reached adulthood, faced an unpredictable world. Every aspect of life, from the food people ate, the work they performed, and the communities they belonged to the spiritual beliefs they held and the natural forces around them, intertwined to determine how long they might live. Life expectancy in the medieval world was therefore not a simple number. It was a story of adaptation, resilience, and the persistent struggle to endure despite pervasive threats. One of the most striking realities of medieval life is the extent to which childhood mortality shaped population statistics. Many individuals did not survive past infancy or early childhood, succumbing to diseases like measles, smallpox, diphtheria, or dysentery. Surviving this period was the first major hurdle, and those who did often possessed both physical resilience and the benefit of favorable circumstances. Nutritious food, protection from epidemics, and attentive care from parents or caregivers. Families understood these risks intimately, and social practices were designed in part to protect the young. Breastfeeding, weaning practices, and the attention of extended family members were essential for a child's survival. In some regions, wet nurses were employed to ensure infants received proper nutrition, while others relied on midwives and herbal remedies to treat childhood illnesses. These practices highlight how survival was as much about careful observation and community support as it was about innate strength. Adulthood brought new challenges and new opportunities for survival. Once the dangerous years of childhood had passed, individuals faced the hazards of labor, nutrition, disease, and social conflict. Physical labor, especially for peasants, created both strength and wear, conditioning the body while exposing it to injury and exhaustion. Workers in cities and towns, from blacksmiths and masons to merchants and craftsmen, contended with occupational hazards unique to their trades. Even for nobles, the dangers of warfare, hunting, and political intrigue imposed risks that could be fatal. The choices individuals made, how they worked, what foods they ate, how they managed risk, and which social networks they engaged, directly influenced their longevity. Life expectancy was therefore deeply intertwined with daily decisions, environment, and circumstance. Diet and nutrition remained central to survival throughout life. Grains, vegetables, legumes, and occasional meat formed the basis of most diets, with the wealthy enjoying more variety and exotic ingredients. Malnutrition, famine, and foodborne illness threatened the survival of both peasants and nobles alike. Successful storage techniques, such as drying, salting, and smoking food, could prevent shortages and reduce the risk of illness, while no